Yeah, hi there. Welcome at this presentation, What is Management? Towards a critique of management. And maybe as a sort of kickoff, I can start with the experience that I entered this field of philosophy of management 10 years ago. In Oxford, we had a conference, the philosophy of management, where I presented my paper, and I was just starting to work at a business department as a philosopher. And I raised the question for myself, what is philosophy? What is management? And that is a logical question for a philosopher to ask, of course, because management is everywhere. It is not only the business that is managed or an organization that is managed by a manager, but it almost seems to constitute a human condition. We do self-management, we do household management. Even in the planetary sense, planet Earth has to be managed. So what does it actually mean? And now if you look at say, textbook and evidence, then management is often characterized by managerial control, power, and managerial power. But then a philosopher wouldn't be happy with that definition and would still ask what it is. So imagine that you are Socrates and you ask a manager, a CEO of a company or an organization, public organization, what is management? And the answer is, it is about managerial control and it's about power. Then you could answer as an imaginary Socrates, okay, but if we encounter new phenomena like social enterprises, or we encounter sustainable innovations, or that serve primarily the common good, can we call the management of these type of organizations, can we call them, can we understand them sufficiently in terms of power and control? Or imagine as a Socrates, you could also argue, okay, power and control, but there are many instances of failure and the vulnerability of organizations, for instance, misfortune or bankruptcy. So to what extent is power sufficient to understand management, or control an ideal of management if this reality of misfortune is a reality? Can we still frame it in these terms? And then we are a little bit in aporia. Aporia because we do not exactly know anymore what is management and what we mean with it. And one would expect, okay, that is great. Let's go to the philosophers. The philosophers, they should think about what is questions. So let's turn to a philosopher. And in one of my great colleagues, Paul Griseri, in 2013 wrote a book, The Introduction of Philosophy to the Philosophy of Management. And in section 1, he raises even the question, the what of management. But strangely enough, there is no answer provided to this question. There's only an answer to the question, to the what of work or leadership or organization. And what is an organization? What is leadership? And this is, of course, very important, but it doesn't give an answer to my stupid question, maybe. What do we actually mean with management? And also the same can be observed in the journal Philosophy of Management, which is also a great journal starting in 2001. And already in the first issue, Bray argued or asked, why is it that management seems to have no history? And there seems to be no reflection on the business management concept in the literature. Of course, there are exceptions, but in general. What you often see in this journal is that there is a focus on the application of philosophical traditions to management issues. For instance, what Levinas thinks about his concept of the other, the third, how it could enable us to think about collaboration, or how Heidegger's being in the world can inform our understanding of a workplace. But we do not necessarily ask the question, what is the philosophy of management of Aristotle or Hegel? Again, this is logical to the extent that these philosophers didn't have a philosophy of management, but they have important things to say in the application to management issues. But the consequence is that the question what management is remains unanswered. So I'm not interested in this talk in leadership, work, or organization, which is all very important. I'm just interested in the stupid question, if there is a philosophy of management, if there is a journal which is called Philosophy of Management, what do we actually, in a philosophical sense, mean with management? So this brings me, in fact, led me to work on a book that is published this year, The Critique of Management Towards a Philosophy and Ethics of Business Management. And in this, I do not mean critique in the critical sense that of course, I'm also critical philosopher, but critique in philosophy means in first instance krinijn, to delineate a phenomenon, in this case, the phenomenon of management. And I will only, in this presentation, will highlight a few of these aspects that I explored much more in depth in the book. And I would like to make 3 steps. And so what is the self-evident concept of management that is around? Questioning the self-evident conceptuality based on an historical analysis. One way to open up self-evident notions is by contrasting current with really old conceptualities then you see the gaps. So that is what I would like to do. It's the second step. And then based on this contrast, I would like to explore building blocks of the philosophy of management. And I in purpose say here, do this at home, because I don't want to claim to have developed the philosophy of management, or that this is a framework that we solved all the questions. No, this is requiring much more effort, I hope, in this regard, to stimulate or encourage you to contribute to this discussion as well. So the first step is what is management? And I didn't do an extensive or systematic literature review, but I assume that you will recognize the steps which are, for instance, made by scientific management. Then the notion of management also as a field of study emerged and became important. Management can be understood as planning, organizing, instruction, coordination, and control. And in first instance, this was very instrumental, how to manage production processes. Later on, based on Mintzberg, Mayo, Follett, also the soft aspects of management, people management, were acknowledged much more. Now, if we talk about management, we have to distinguish between management as in a verbal sense, that means the act of management, and so the act of organizing, the act of using and managing resources. And you can also think of management in the more substantial sense of the word, that people who are engaging in these acts. And a second source that I would like to highlight here is the Oxford Dictionary of Business and Management, because that describes also very well basic understanding of management, no philosophical reflection, but at least an first conceptuality. And it's about the organizational skill to establish and maintain the functioning order of an organization. Managing is managing an organization. This involves also the engagement of subordinates and people management, and it involves a sense of entrepreneurial opportunity recognition. It's not only managing the status quo, but it's also exploring new opportunities and all these kind of things. So now we have at least a sort of clear idea of what management is in the management literature, and that is in a little bit, to say it's a bit strange, but that is unreflected, I would say. And to open this reflection, I would like to introduce to you a great philosopher, Xenophon, who was coming after Aristotle, and who was in fact the first one who wrote a book, Economia, on household management and the management of an independent household and farm in this case. And I just published an article about this, where you can find much more information on this philosophy, but you can argue that this is the first full-fledged philosophy of management. And just to talk you through the 9 elements that I mentioned, that I distinguished between in this, and you can say that in first instance, management is the establishment of a functioning order, and that is corresponding with Taylor's idea of planning, organizing, and control. The strange then step is that Xenophon is saying that this functioning order serves private interest, but also evokes public admiration. And to this end, you have to serve both private and public interest. The interesting thing is that, for instance, in the Greek times, in ancient times, you are a free citizen. The manager is a free citizen. He employs employees, and they have to work on the land. But in case of a war with the Persians, for instance, you have to go to war as a manager, as the business owner, as a free citizen, but you have to bring your personnel as well. And that means that you have to train your personnel in a way that they, on the one hand, serve the business, but in times of war can also engage in warfare. So this is the way he understands the public interest and the private interest that is served by the company, because he is training and he keeps training his employees. And this primary process, farming, for instance, should also serve the purpose of engaging in warfare in the end. So that is the way he deals with private and public interest. And he also interesting, he says, this is something that we have to do via direct labor. So the manager is involved in the primary process, and he is doing this via the work done by others. And so he has to develop a management team. It's really great that he's already talking about these type of things. You need internal rules and regulations and how to keep the place proper and all those kind of things. And you have to direct people. This brings also to the other element. The manager is really involved in training and teaching of these employees. And is also, and that is also for me interesting to acknowledge, that management acknowledges that there is a fundamental role of risk and misfortune, the possibility that things go wrong. And that is the role of the manager, to deal with these possibilities. Proper asset management, and that is also something that we can recognize in the entrepreneurial sense, for instance. And by doing this, serving both private interests of the household, but also public interest. So this is a philosophy of management that is different from ours, our understanding of management, you can distinguish easily some important commonalities. I have them on the next slide. So the establishment and maintenance of functioning order, that is also what you can find in this Oxford Dictionary of Business Management. That is also recognized in Xenophon. People management is recognized, and this asset management and entrepreneurial action. So, of course, you can argue that these elements are already calling for philosophical reflection about leadership or organization. That is fine, but I leave them, these three elements, and I just accept them because I want to concentrate on more critical elements that you can find in Xenophon. So for this moment, we accept these three characteristics that you can find in management literature and in Xenophon as, okay, these are elements, dimensions of management that should inform our philosophical concept of management. But you also have, let's say, contrasts or contested areas. And the interesting thing, for instance, is that in our case, we tend to say that management primarily serves self-interest, whether it's profit or my own human flourishing, for instance, while public admiration, serving society is a central element in Xenophon. The second interesting difference is that while we tend to think that the manager is a little bit outside the primary process and is not engaged in the primary process, but has an overview, is looking at it, is managing this primary process. According to Xenophon, it is really the case that the manager is involved in this direct labor, in this this process. And the third difference is this fundamental role of risk and misfortune that is acknowledged, of course, also in our literature on entrepreneurial risk. We talk about this, but it is not a central element in our understanding of management. So, in a way, we could say that we have that based on Xenophon's understanding of management, we have reason to question self-evident understandings of management as control and power, because we can argue we have the tendency to look at instrumental management in the instrumental sense, that the knowledge of the manager is business administration knowledge instead of content-based or sector-specific knowledge. The manager is external to the primary process, is independent as the controller of this primary process, while the employee is within the process. So that is the first contrast that we can identify. The second one is between control and the acknowledgement of misfortune. And the central role for Xenophon in fallibility and vulnerability might lead us to the acknowledgement of this central role of misfortune in the notion of management. So, for instance, Taylor is talking about one best way of management, but that's a sort of ideal that in reality doesn't occur. And the third possible difference that we contested area is that we tend to think about management in terms of profit or self-serving, while here you see that you can also think about management in terms of self-serving, serving society. So to sum up the argument till now, if we compare the textbook knowledge about management and Xenophon's philosophy of management, we find three areas of commonality: managing the functioning order, people management, and entrepreneurial action. And we find three potential areas of contestation. And I would like to focus now a little bit more on these 3 areas of contestation and to open up our conceptuality towards a philosophy of management. And I would like to explore instrumental management versus management as participation, management as control versus management as resistance, and managing for profit versus managing as constitution of meaning in the next coming slides. So management as participation. So in instrumental management can be characterized as the loss of participation, the loss of the involvement of the manager in the primary process. And this loss of participation is often associated with management by numbers, focus on computation, calculation, and bureaucracy. This is criticized because it neglects the individual professional in favor of general governance mechanisms. And it also neglects the individual moral impulse of professionals and also managers. And that might lead to unethical behavior. So there is a lot of criticism on this idea of instrumental management. Well, we could say that Xenophon, but also our own reflections, could lead to an alternative understanding of management as participation. So according to, you can say that management is about guiding people, teaching people, identifying new opportunities for improvement or betterment of processes. And this requires a know-how. And this know-how is not only an instrumental know-how of bureaucratic rules and regulations or how to develop strategies, but it is also embedded in knowledge about a sector. So participation is also a self-referential term. It refers to me as the substance that is engaged in this act of management. And for instance, if I have a background as a health professional, I take this experience as a health professional with me if I become a manager of health professionals. I can bring also my personal history in the participation of this primary process. It is not only my knowledge about strategizing or financial asset management, but it's also my personal history, my gender, my regional embedding, my intellectual development, my talents that I bring on board. And these type of know-how, constituting know-how, is also informing the opportunities that I recognize and that I engage with. So based on the criticism of instrumental management, we could think about an alternative conceptualization of management as participation that is highlighting much more the engagement of management in the primary process, and that is much more highlighting the role of know-how that is informing management practices. Second, management as resistance. So management is often characterized by bureaucratic control, and this controls the control of the status quo. It is often argued. And this is also criticized because the focus on computation and calculation, which neglects individual professional behavior. Right? That is also why sometimes people distinguish between management and entrepreneurship, for instance. While, as we have seen, entrepreneurial action is also part of an organization of management in the previous slides. So maybe we can take another direction here and reject, let's say, the idea of managerial control by asking ourselves what in fact initiates the act of management. And the interesting thing, if we talk about management and business development, it starts all with market failure. And for instance, customers experience a problem with connectivity, and then there is a company that is developing cell phones or inventing or engages in innovations to develop cell phones. And this is a new product or service that enters the market. But you can also think of ecosystem failures. For instance, we are facing now climate change that is experienced as a problem, and business managers can come up with new products and services that are green or regenerative by design, for instance. And if you look at management from this perspective, not control is the distinguishing factor, but the fact that management starts with a problem in the world. There is a problem, whether it's sustainability or connectivity, so to speak, and the manager doesn't face reality and bends to the facts, so to speak, but he is oriented on an imaginary of a potential future in which this problem is solved. And based on this imagination, this manager starts to change the world. So instead of defining management as control, we can also define it in terms of resistance. Resistance against the current world as it is, and acting out to change the world. So it involves a new beginning, new products, new action. And this new beginning involves the structural role of risk and failure. So new beginnings always involve an entrepreneurial risk, which is also sometimes called an uninsurable risk. But not only that, because also there are societal risks, for instance, for employees or personnel. Customers think of the current developments in artificial intelligence and the risks they involve for employees or the potential solutions that they can bring. So this wish of resistance and acting out limits the potential role of managerial control. And for this reason, you could argue that management is in need of public approval. We can frame this in terms of a social license to operate. And so acting out is responsive to societal needs and concerns. And this substantiates then an idea of managerial resistance and action as an alternative for managerial control. Third topic. Often in our understanding, management is profit-driven or self-interested for your own flourishing, which is, you can argue, also at odds with the reality of new emerging management practices in social and sustainable business practices. And so you could argue that even if you acknowledge that management is profit-driven, it is only a special case of management, because there are also other forms of management that are not profit-driven. So this raises the question, what is then the primary performance of management? And to this end, I would like to present a quote by Xenophon, the one that we discussed already earlier. Now I saw this man in his spare time inspecting everything that is needed as a matter of course on the ship. I was surprised to see him looking them over and asked what he was doing. Sir, he answered, I'm looking to see how the ship's equipment is stored in case of any accident, or whether anything is missing or mixed up with other equipment. So what is interesting here is that when the weather is bright, it is a good way to sail, and if the rope or the employees are not in a good order, it is not really a big deal. But in case of a stormy weather, you want to find blindly all the equipment that you need to steer and to manage the ship in a good way. But it is not only about risk prevention, so to speak, this management that this man is talking about. He is talking about the production of an order, and this constitutes what he, and I quote, a paradise of beauty that evokes admiration. So the rope, the line, the boat, and the people, the sailor, form a sort of order, according to Xenophon. What is order? Now, the interesting thing is that if you think about order, that order is not connected with resources themselves. For instance, it is not the case that wood or iron in itself has a particular order. But if I produce hammers as a company, then wood and iron have a proper place in this production process. Like just as wool, for instance, doesn't have a proper place in this production process. Or like the person who's playing the violin or a conductor of an orchestra doesn't have a proper place in the production process of a hammer. So the primary processes assigns resources their proper place. Rope, net, sailor, and ship constitute an orderly arrangement as a meaningful whole that relates all these resources to each other and bring them together in the world of fishing, for instance, or the world of transport, or the world of making hammers. So management can be seen as the production of this meaningful world for the business operations. And you could argue that this involves also his or her participation, the participation of the manager as the sailor. So here we have good reason to say management is often seen as profit-driven, self-interested, but in fact management is about the constitution of a meaningful whole, meaningful world. So to conclude, we started with the self-evident understanding of management and contrasted it with Xenophon's philosophy of management. Based on this, we identified 3 common characteristics that are also here in this table. Establishing of a functional order, people management, and asset management and entrepreneurial action. And already, as I said, we can argue, we can question what we mean with organization, work, and all these kind of things. But for a moment, I accept that these elements are characteristic for a philosophy of management and require much more work. Also, we saw that Xenophon provided good reasons to move beyond all kinds of self-evident understandings of management related to instrumentality, profit, and control. And that enabled us to develop 3 more critical dimensions of business management, which are then associated with the 4th, 5th, and 6th dimension I have depicted here, namely the participation of the manager in the primary process, the resistance and acting out as a characteristic of management, and management as the constitution of meaning. So with this, I have tried to lay the ground for a philosophy of management. And I think this is important because I think the task of philosophy of management is not to accept the status quo and the current conceptuality, but that the role is to develop new theories of imagination for management science. And I proposed a framework with 6 building blocks for this future philosophy of management. And I don't want to claim that I provided a full-fledged philosophy. In my book, I try to make sense of these 6 building blocks. And I also focus much more in the book on sustainable management and on ethics and on individual competencies of managers, and all things that I cannot touch upon today in this presentation. But it is also an open source in the sense that it is an invitation to develop collectively such a philosophy of management. In this regard, I also mean serious, do this at home and see my work mainly as an inspiration. I would like to thank you for your attention. I would like to thank you, my team, because without the dedication and contribution of the team, I was not able to do all this work. So thank you very much.